News of the Times. Britain's first private execution, the murder of the Dover Stationmaster in 1868. Today we're travelling back to 1868, a year of dramatic change in British justice. Public executions had just been abolished, and what happened behind prison walls was suddenly hidden from the crowds who had once gathered in their thousands. And into this brand new world stepped one of the first men to face the consequences, an 18-year-old railway carriage cleaner named Thomas Wells. This episode begins at Dover Priory Station, where the stationmaster is shot, a crime that shocks the railway community and leaves investigators scrambling for answers. What follows is a case built on early witness statements, Victorian workplace tensions, and a confession that arrived under circumstances that still raise eyebrows today. But the real significance of this story lies not only in the murder itself, but in what came next. When Wells was sentenced, Britain had just outlawed the spectacle of public hanging. For the first time, executions moved indoors, private, unseen, and tightly controlled. And Thomas Wells became the first person in the country to meet this new fate. In this episode, we explore the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the social mood of a nation that had only just shut its prison gates to the public. It's a story about change, responsibility, and the uneasy line between justice and spectacle. This is the case of Thomas Wells, and the first private execution in British history. Note, Priscilla Biggersdyke later that year became the first woman privately executed. Stay with us for our end of episode further particulars, where even the ferrets of Norfolk appear to have embraced the Victorian spirit of opportunism. So sit back, relax, and let's return together to a Britain on the cusp of change, where a single murder at a quiet railway station marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The 1868 Execution Act. The Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868 brought an end to centuries of public hangings in Britain. Until this point, executions took place outside prison walls, often drawing crowds of tens of thousands. The Act required that from 1868 onward, all executions must be carried out privately behind the closed gates of a prison, witnessed only by official observers. The reasons for the change were growing and complex. Public executions had long been criticised for becoming a kind of grim entertainment. Instead of inspiring moral reflection, the crowds often erupted into drunkenness, violence, pickpocketing, and carnival-like behaviour. Reformers argued that these spectacles did more harm than good, brutalising the public rather than deterring crime. There were also concerns about dignity and order. Many felt the state should administer the death penalty with restraint and solemnity, not as a street performance. By moving executions inside, the government hoped to reinforce the idea of justice conducted calmly, responsibly, and without public spectacle. The Act did not challenge the death penalty itself. That debate would come much later. But it did transform how it was carried out. The execution of Thomas Wells in August 1868 marked the beginning of this new era. Punishment hidden from the public eye, delivered with formality rather than theatre. Thomas Wells was just 18 years old, barely a man, still closer to adolescence than adulthood, working as a railway carriage cleaner at Dover Priory Station. He was known as quiet, sullen, and increasingly resentful of authority, the kind of young labourer who carries a grudge heavily and struggled under the strict Victorian discipline of railway life. What makes his story particularly striking is that he was soon to be married. The newspapers noted this detail with a tone of melancholy, a future laid out before him, a wife to be waiting, a young man seemingly on the cusp of settling into adult life. And yet, beneath that outward path towards respectability, Wells was stewing over reprimands, convinced he had been treated unfairly, and allowing a sense of grievance to fester. He spent his off hours reading the illustrated police news, absorbing its lurid tales of crime and retribution, believed to be precisely the kind of material that might feed the imagination of somebody already brooding. In the days leading up to the murder, it made a series of chilling deliberate choices: acquiring gunpowder, testing a pistol, and making veiled threats after being disciplined at work. When the moment came, it unfolded in the cramped office of the stationmaster. One impulsive, violent act ended not only the life of Edward Walshe, but the life Wells might have had, the ordinary future of marriage, stability, and adulthood. And it placed him at the centre of history. For when Wells was sentenced, Britain had just abolished public hangings, and as a result, he became the very first person ever executed in private inside prison walls, an unintended symbol of national reform enacted on an 18-year-old adult. From the Dover Telegraph and Cinque Ports General Advertiser, 6th of May, 1868. Awful tragedy in Dover. A most awful murder was committed in Dover on the morning of Friday last. The victim was Mr. Edward Adolphus Walshe, 58 years of age, the stationmaster at the Priory Station of the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, and the murderer was a young man, or rather a youth, for he'd only seen 19 summers, named Thomas Wells, a porter employed at the same place. The intelligence was so startling and so terrible in its nature that it was not at the moment credited. But the large body of people that flocked down to the scene of the murder soon ascertained that the intelligence was only too true. The facts of the awful catastrophe are very simple and are most conclusive as to the guilt of Wells. They form an almost perfect chain, not the slightest doubt existing as to his being the murderer. The young man was employed at the place named as a carriage cleaner, for his duties were confined to work outside the station, amongst the railway carriages, which are always kept there in large numbers, ready for any emergency. He was supposed to keep them clean and had been engaged at that work for about 18 months. From what we can learn, his conduct during that time was not altogether satisfactory. He was rather inclined every now and then to sulk. his work did not always do it properly. Mr. Walshe, in his capacity as chief officer at the station, therefore found it necessary on several occasions to reprimand him, and Wells, like most people of an obstinate and revengeful disposition, did not take his correction in the same spirit as Mr. Walshe gave it. On Thursday evening, Wells was amusing himself by practising with firearms either on or near the premises of the company, and Mr. Walshe, learning that he was the offender, afterwards spoke to him respecting it in his office of the station. Wells did not deny having been the offender, but alleged that he had not exploded his firearms on the premises of the company, but in the field adjoining. He was much chagrined at this correction, and expressed his determination to a firebox boy named Charles Sinclair early on Friday morning to shoot the old, meaning young Sinclair believed, Mr. Walshe. The young man's morose disposition was so well known that neither Sinclair nor anyone else took any particular notice of the threat, which was thought to be one uttered in a fit of anger by a person of an irascible nature, and would be forgotten when the anger was in some measure cooled by the lapse of time. On the Thursday evening, Mr. Walshe had written a note to Mr. Henry Cox, the superintendent of the two stations in Dover, asking him to be at the Priory Station on Friday morning in order to inquire into the conduct of Wells. At the appointed time, Mr. Cox came, and Wells was called before him, and Mr. Walshe, Mr. Cox, told the young fellow that he must be more respectful in his bearing toward Mr. Walshe, that Wells was not inclined in any degree to express sorrow for what he had done. He was impudent to Mr. Cox himself, and that gentleman, seeing that the offender was inclined to defend his conduct, gave him 10 minutes to retire and calmly consider the matter. He then returned and expressed his regret at what had taken place, and promised amendment in the future. Then the complaint had been framed to Mr. Martin, the superintendent of the Eastern Division of the line, would be withheld. Wells left the office, spoke to John Golder, a porter, and said he was going to be reported. He asked for some water, drank it, and went away. He did not, Golder says, appear at all excited. He returned to Mr. Walsh's office, but did not apologize. He said, in reply to Mr. Cox, that he had nothing to say to Mr. Walshe, and Mr. Cox began writing a report against him. Wells left the office and must, according to Mr. Cox's statement, have gone straight to the place where the loaded gun had been left, supposedly to somewhere about the station. Only 2 or 3 minutes had elapsed before Mr. Cox, who was writing at Mr. Walsh's table, was alarmed by a loud report quite near him. Mr. Walshe, who at this moment was standing with his back to the fireplace, fell down shot through the head. The office is a very small room, and at the time it was fired, the muzzle of the gun could not have been more than 3 or 4 yards from the person at whom it was directed. Its aim was only too sure. The bullet of what is called the mini shape struck Mr. Walshe in the face, a little to the left of the bridge of the nose, and passed through the head, striking the wall beyond, taking with it a portion of the skull of the deceased, and bespattering a number of papers with his blood. Death was instantaneous, the bullet passing right through the brain and tore away a portion of the face. Mr. Walshe fell across the fireplace, and Mr. Cox, whose consternation and horror can better be imagined than described, at once gave the alarm. Medical assistance was immediately sent for, and Mr. A. G. Osborne, surgeon, was quickly in attendance. His services, however, were of course without the slightest avail. Several porters and platelayers responded to Mr. Cox's cry for help, but before they got to the office of the murderer, it had disappeared, and they found Mr. Walshe where he had fallen, a corpse. Information was promptly given to the police, and Superintendent Courtroom, with Police Sergeant Stevens and Police Constable Raymond, were quickly on the scene of the murder. They at once commenced a search for the prisoner, who was ultimately found in an empty second-class carriage in the carriage shed outside the station. He had the gun between his knees when he was discovered, and, on the door being opened, he quietly handed out the weapon and gave himself into the hands of the police, without making the slightest resistance and without speaking a word. He was taken at once to the police station and was charged with the murder of Mr. Walshe. But he made no reply to the accusation. Indeed, the only time he spoke was on the road to the police station, when he told the superintendent that the gun was not loaded. The gun, which is supposed to belong to the prisoner's father, a fisherman in Round Tower Street, bore such marks as led the police to be certain that it was the weapon he used to effect his diabolical purpose. It is an old weapon, and at one time had a flintlock which had been altered into the present shape. The porter, Golder, was in the lamp room at the time of the report, 40 yards from the scene of the murder, and he saw Wells running away from the office with the gun in his hand. Mr. Walshe, the deceased gentleman, was respected by everyone who ever came into personal contact with him. He lived in a house adjoining the station and contiguous to the office in which he met his dreadful fate. We can ourselves bear testimony to his uniform courtesy. He was liked by the passengers and valued by his employers. Besides, he was a man of superior attainments, having been educated for and called to the bar whilst a young man, and he had practised as an English lawyer in Paris for some time. He was a son of Mr. Walshe, who held a high appointment in the customs, and his brother is similarly employed now. Formerly, Mr. Walshe was at the Addisham station of the London, Chatham and Dover Railway, and then he came to Dover. The deceased leaves a wife and a daughter. On the day before the murder, in conversation with Mrs. Walshe, he said that he hoped, in the event of anything happening to him, he should be buried at Brompton Cemetery, where his son was interred. His wishes in that respect will not be carried out, and any of his late friends who wish to be present and pay a last tribute of respect to the deceased will be furnished with free passes to London and back. Thomas Wells. The prisoner Wells is as unlikely a murderer as anyone can imagine. He is short of build and of youthful appearance. From what we can learn, he has been in the habit of reading such a publication as the Illustrated Police News, which must have had a pernicious effect upon a person like himself, and familiarized his mind with scenes of violence. His demeanour since his arrest has been remarkable for an entire absence of anything like sorrow for his crime. It would appear that he is entirely deficient of natural feeling, and he conducts himself in jail much as if he were merely there for some trifling crime, altogether forgetting that his dreadful doom is certain and sure. The shock in Dover was immediate. Violent crime of this kind was rare in the town, and rarer still in the orderly world of the railways. Word spread quickly through the station yard and into the streets, and a community more accustomed to minor disturbances than murder found itself suddenly shaken. Wells was brought before the magistrate later that day, where he maintained the same unsettling silence he had shown since his arrest, offering no explanation, no protest, not even regret. The sense of unease only deepened. Magistrates, hearing the following morning, drew a crowd so large that the hall overflowed. Dover was a quiet town. A murder at its railway station was not merely shocking, it felt unthinkable. Into this packed room, Thomas Wells was brought, looking more like a boy than a killer, and showing a level of calm that unnerved nearly everyone present. He even turned and smiled at familiar faces in the gallery. When the formal charge of wilful murder was put to him, Wells said nothing. The evidence presented was straightforward. Witnesses described the reprimand Wells had received shortly before the shooting, the sound of the gunshot, and Wells running from the stationmaster's office with the weapon still in his hands. A porter had watched him flee towards the carriage sheds, and police soon found him sitting quietly inside an empty second-class coach, the gun beside him. The firearm showed clear signs of having been discharged, and a percussion cap matching the weapon was found in Wells's pocket. With the chain of events so clear, the magistrates granted a remand for further inquiries and preparation of the case. Wells was led away, showing the same indifference he had displayed since his arrest, a composure that struck many as almost as disturbing as the crime itself. From the Dover Telegraph and Cinque Ports General Advertiser, the 6th of May, 1868, the inquest. The inquest was held at the Maison du Hall before Mr. Payne, the coroner, at 1 o'clock on the same day. The jury, having viewed the body, which still lay at the station, and returned to the hall. The inquest unfolded much as the magistrate's hearing had done, steady, methodical, and with little room for doubt. Witnesses repeated the core facts, the reprimand, the brief interval before the shot, and Wells being seen running from the office with the gun still in his hands. Henry Cox confirmed there had been no time for Wells to load a weapon after leaving the office, meaning the gun must already have been prepared. The surgeon restated that the wound was instantly fatal, and the porter reaffirmed that he had seen Wells flee immediately after the report. What shifted the atmosphere was the final witness, a young firebox boy, Charles Sinclair, testified that Wells had told him early in that morning that he intended to shoot the old if he was spoken to again. It was not a drunken boast or a muttered frustration. It was a direct threat spoken hours before the murder. The juries needed no further persuasion. After a brief consultation, they delivered their conclusion with unusual speed. Edward Adolphus Walshe had died from a gunshot wound willfully fired by Thomas Wells. It was, in effect, a verdict of wilful murder, clearing the path to a full trial at the next assizes. With the inquest complete and a verdict of wilful murder returned, the case moved steadily toward trial. Wells himself remained stubbornly silent throughout, offering neither explanation nor defence, and was brought once more before the magistrates as further evidence emerged. It now appeared that several days before the shooting he had purchased gunpowder, a detail that raised an uncomfortable question. Had Wells walked into that office already harbouring a plan to kill the stationmaster? Or were these preparations, as he might later claim, be nothing more than coincidence? Whatever the truth, the path to the assizes was now unmistakable, and the full weight of the law was gathering around him. From the Dover Telegraph and Cinque Port's General Advertiser on the 13th of May, 1868, the terrible murder in Dover, the re-examination of the prisoner. The prisoner, Thomas Wells, was brought up at the Sessions House on Wednesday morning at 11 for re-examination. The greatest interest was evinced in the proceedings throughout. During the examination, the prisoner had the same fixed, unmovable countenance throughout the entire 2 hours and a half that he was in the dock. We may take this opportunity of saying that the prisoner kept company with a young woman in the service of a gallant officer of the garrison, to whom he was about to be married. Mr. Cletherer opened the proceedings by saying it was unnecessary for him to make any further remarks as to the facts of the case, as it was already in the minds of the bench, and he should proceed to call the evidence that had since gathered, by which he would clearly show that Wells had made use of his murderous threats to several persons the day before he committed the murder. Witnesses now came forward to describe Wells's behaviour in the days before the murder. A local ironmonger testified that, on the morning of the killing, Wells had walked into his shop and calmly bought gunpowder, 3 ounces of it, and attempted to purchase percussion caps as well. A second boy in the shop confirmed the exchange. Another engine driver recalled hearing Wells swearing angrily the day before, muttering about a life and gesturing towards the stationmaster with bitter resentment. Several railway workers described threats made on Thursday evening, Wells stating openly that he would let the old man have it, and that if the stationmaster said much to him, he would shoot him, each man thinking him merely overheated, and he shrugged the words off. But taken together, the statements formed a damning pattern. Wells had threatened the stationmaster repeatedly, acquired powder and caps, tested a firearm the night before, and walked into work with violence clearly in his mind. Even the pistol itself became part of this picture. A carriage examiner confirmed that Wells had been firing it behind the sheds. A casual bit of fun, they said, but unmistakably preparation for the shot fired the next morning. Magistrates hearing this new evidence had no hesitation in committing Wells fully for trial. What had at first looked like a sudden act of rage now appeared to be a deliberate killing. The question facing the assizes was no longer what happened, but whether the law saw this as a cold, premeditated murder and, under the new 1868 rules, whether Wells would become the first man to meet his death behind closed prison doors. In the trial, the prosecution's position was now unmistakably strong. Wells had not only threatened his station master, but had bought gunpowder days earlier and tested a firearm on company grounds, actions difficult to interpret as anything other than preparation. When the case reached the assizes, the central question for the jury was stark. Had Wells acted in a sudden fit of temper, as his defence suggested, or had he walked into that office intending to kill? The distinction was everything. If the shooting could somehow be viewed as manslaughter, a rash act, however terrible, Wells faced a lifetime in prison. But if the jury found premeditation, even in the smallest measure, then the law at the time left only one outcome, a sentence of death. And so the trial began, with the courtroom packed and the eyes of the town fixed on a young man who now stood not only accused of murder, but poised to make legal history. The trial of Thomas Wells. When Wells finally stood before the court, much of the evidence had already been aired through the magistrate and the inquest. The trial itself was in many ways a summation, a drawing together of threads already familiar to the townspeople who packed the gallery. The prosecution's case rested on three pillars: premeditation, threats, and preparation. They reminded the jury that Wells had been seen carrying a gun as early as 5 o'clock on the morning of the murder, and that he had openly threatened to shoot the old after a quarrel with the stationmaster, and that he had purchased gunpowder only hours before the killing, asking specifically for percussion caps. Combined with the firing of a pistol the previous evening, the sequence of events painted a troubling picture, not of momentary loss of control, but of a young man quietly setting the stage. In closing, counsel for the Crown delivered a stark warning. Gentlemen, his life is in your hands. Use all your efforts to consider every fact that has been brought before you today. The defence, led by Mr. Slay, had a difficult task. They attempted to suggest that Wells had acted impulsively, perhaps muddled in his understanding, perhaps even shaken by a minor accident earlier in the week. But the prosecution dismantled these claims with precision. The threats, they argued, were too pointed. The purchase of powder too deliberate, the firing of the weapon too accurate to be the act of someone incapable of understanding his own actions. The prosecution pressed the matter further. If the jury dismissed the notion of accident and, he argued, the facts allowed no other conclusion, then manslaughter was impossible. What remained, however, grim was murder. He pointed the jury back to the timeline. Wells leaves the stationmaster's office without apology, and 10 minutes later he is seen retrieving the gun. 2 minutes after that, the shot rings out. The stationmaster falls dead where he stands. It was, he insisted, as simple as it was clear. The defence had called Wells's parents to suggest he had been unsettled, even injured, in the days leading up to the shooting, but this, the Crown argued, explained nothing. None of his co-workers had seen any sign of impairment. Nothing in his conduct suggested confusion. If anything, he had behaved with chilling purpose, walking into the office armed levelling the gun with deadly accuracy, and then fleeing the moment the deed was done. From the Dover Telegraph and Cinque Port's General Advertiser, the 29th of July, 1868. The Dover murder case. His Lordship, in summing up, said the prisoner Thomas Wells was charged with the murder of Mr. Walshe at the Priory Station in Dover. It was no part of his duty to answer the speech of the learned counsel for the prisoner, but he felt that it was his duty, and he should not shrink for a moment from performing it, to inform them that the law of this country was that any man who deliberately killed another was guilty of the crime of wilful murder, and they must find the prisoner guilty of that offence or acquit him altogether. Undoubtedly, the prisoner committed the crime, where he was seen by a driver at the west end of the station running away from the office. Then, as to provocation, that only applied when there was something which the law allowed to be a provocative acting on the mind, so as to unsettle and disorder it, and take away the presumption of malice. But the provocation must be of a substantial kind, and it was not, if it was much as it resulted merely from one man speaking angrily to another. Appeals have been made to the jury to consider such provocation sufficient to excuse or to reduce to manslaughter the crime of shooting intentionally at another so as to cause his death. He must therefore repeat that if the prisoner had intentionally shot the gun off against the deceased, then he was guilty of murder. As to the evidence for the defence, as he said at the time, he hardly knew what it meant. If it meant insanity, then the question for the jury would be whether it was made out that the prisoner did not know the nature of his act. If so, he was entitled to be acquitted on the ground of insanity. But if all that was meant was that the prisoner was of an excitable character or temperament, then that would be no excuse. Although a man, whether from misfortune or otherwise, was of a more excitable temperament than other men, he was equally bound to keep his temper under control, and was equally liable to the penalties imposed by the law upon the crime of murder. The learned judge, in conclusion, told the jury that the question was whether the prisoner intentionally fired the gun at the deceased. If so, then he was guilty of murder, and if they were not satisfied of that, then they could acquit him. The jury then retired. Within 5 minutes afterwards, there was a rumour that the jury were returning, and on their entering behind the judge, all eyes were fixed upon them. On the clerk asking their verdict, the foreman replied with great emphasis, "Guilty." The prisoner answering nothing to the question why sentence should not be pronounced, the judge put on the black cap, and in a faltering voice and visibly affected, proceeded to pass the sentence upon the prisoner. Although there were murmurs of unease about executing someone so young, a youth whose temper had flared, whose resentment had curdled into something deadly, sympathy in Dover lay firmly elsewhere. Mr. Walshe had been greatly liked in the community, courteous, educated, respected by his colleagues, and trusted by travellers. His sudden death left a widow and a daughter in shock, and public sentiment tilted heavily toward justice being carried through. And so, despite his age, the sentence stood. What made Wells's fate even more remarkable was the moment in which it occurred. The new law abolishing public hangings had come into force scarcely months before, and the machinery of British justice was still adjusting to life behind closed gates. When the date of the execution was set, it carried an unintended distinction. Thomas Wells would not only pay the ultimate price for the murder of his stationmaster, he would become the first person in Britain to be executed in private under the new Act. From the Illustrated Police News, the 15th of August, 1868, the execution of Wells, the Dover murderer in Maidstone Jail. The doom of the unfortunate man Wells, who was convicted of the murder of Mr. Walshe, Stationmaster of Dover, at the late assizes, seemed from the very first to be inevitable. No attempt has been made by those persons who have a horror of the punishment of death to save the wretched culprit's life, a respite that never for a moment had been contemplated, and people seem to have come to a tacit understanding that the law must take its course in this particular ease. Public sympathy has been enlisted on behalf of many worse criminals than Wells, and in all probability petitions would have been sent to the Home Secretary's office praying for a respite had it not been for one noteworthy fact. Fate ordained that the Dover murderer should be the first man to suffer the extreme penalty of the law within the walls of the prison, and people were anxious to see how the new Act of Parliament would work. Since his condemnation, the guilty man appears to have maintained a demeanour of quiet self-possession, which appears to be natural, for there was no assumption of the bravado occasionally evinced by prisoners of callous and brutal nature. He paid great attention to the ministrations of the chaplain, the Reverend Fraser. Wells was engaged to a young woman at Dover, and he addressed many letters to her, both before and since his condemnation. Last week, he sent a letter to Mr. Cox, the superintendent of the Harbour Station, asking his forgiveness for the sorrow that he had caused him, and requesting the address of Mrs. Walshe. The scaffold. The erection of the permanent scaffold was commenced some days before the specified one on which the extreme penalty of the law was to be carried into effect. The site chosen for the scaffold is in the enclosed yard adjoining the debtors' prison. The wood and ironwork of the old top have been used, but as the structure is to be permanent, it has been covered with an iron roofing, and it has been deemed advisable to hide it from the view of the inmates of the prison by movable shutters. It is built on a level with the prison yard, an excavation having been made for the drop, to which access is given by 4 steps on each side. According to the late Act of Parliament, to provide against any suspicion that the law has not been strictly carried out, the coroner of the district is, within 24 hours of the execution, to hold an inquest, and the jury is to be satisfied as to the identity of the body, and that judgment of death was duly executed. The execution. The extreme punishment was carried out into effect at 10:30 upon Thomas Wells, a culprit who only attained his 18th year in March last. There were very few, if any, strangers in the vicinity of the prison, and the town presented its ordinary appearance. A few of the tradesmen and other inhabitants might have been observed conversing together upon the sad spectacle that was going on within the walls of the prison, but the town generally presented a naked and extraordinary contrast to that which it has exhibited upon occasions when executions have taken place in public. A black flag was raised on the wall of the prison when the bolt was withdrawn. After the body had been suspended 1 hour, it was cut down and the flag fell. The case of Thomas Wells leaves behind a tragic and tangle of difficult reflections. A young man, barely on the threshold of adulthood, whose stubborn pride, bitterness, and wounded vanity hardened into something fatally irreversible, and a respected stationmaster simply carrying out his duties, whose life was taken in a moment of shocking violence. In another era, Wells's execution might have played out before a restless crowd, the final act of a Victorian morality play. But Britain had turned a corner. With the passing of the 1868 Act, the spectacle was gone. The gallows had moved indoors, and so it fell to Thomas Wells, at only 19, to become the first person in the nation to meet his end in private, a precedent set not only by intention, but by timing. For the next 90 years, Britain would continue to carry out executions behind prison walls. From 1868 until the last hangings in 1964, more than 1,000 men and women would walk the same quiet, unseen path. No crowds, no carnival, only officials, silence and procedure. Wells's story, then, is not only a tragedy of 2 lives altered forever, but the beginning of a new chapter in British justice, one in which punishment stepped out of public square and into the shadows. A young man, a lost temper, a respected victim, and a nation crossing a threshold. A case that marked both an end and a beginning. Further particulars. Today's further particulars story comes from Norfolk, where we learn an important lesson. Never assume loyalty from a ferret. Even when you're an 82-year-old professional vermin destroyer, one might think decades of service would earn at least a moment's respect. But as it turned out, ferrets are tragically indifferent to human retirement planning. From the Illustrated Police News, 11th of February, 1899. Man killed by ferrets. At an inquest held at Sutton in Norfolk on the body of James Collins, it was shown that while following his occupation as a vermin destroyer, the deceased was seized with an apoplectic fit. Collins, who was 82 years of age, had the presence of mind to throw a rabbit to his ferrets. The larger, however, attacked him in ferocious manner, some 30 wounds being inflicted on his face. Well, was I much injured? 2 days later, Collins died from his injuries. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into Victorian justice. Tale of tempers, tragedy, and a rather grim place in the history books. If you enjoyed the episode, do give it a like, a share, or subscribe. And if you feel moved to grace us with a hype, please know that it is considered the diamond standard of appreciation here at News of the Time HQ, prompting celebrity dance moves that have not evolved since ABBA last topped the charts. It is not impressive, but it is enthusiastic. For those who'd like to step further into our world of historical crime, our Patreon is now home to more than 400 lost and hard to find Victorian and Edwardian cases, along with 3 exclusive series and, launching in February 2026, a brand new downloadable PDF collection available only to members. All of it unlocked with a single £5 membership, and you can cancel any time with just one click. No fuss, no drama, just more stories whenever you want them. This has been News of the Times, and I am Robin Coles, part-time historian, occasional tea temperature analyst, and self-declared chief officer for misplaced stationery. Until next time, may your week be peaceful, your trains on time, and your household geese well behaved. See you next time. Same News of the Time, same News of the Time channel.